We're rolling? All right, great. All right, thank you all for joining us for a Q&A session with our keynote speaker and educator, Caroline Hill.
Hi, friends.
We're excited to have Caroline here to answer your questions, so please feel free to go into today's Thought Exchange link and submit your questions. So we've been watching that conversation, and we pulled the themes out and some of the questions we've received. We will ask Caroline to provide us with her thoughts on those. So with that, I want to introduce Dr. Allison Gillespie. If you want to give a wave. So Dr. Gillespie is our new Assistant Superintendent for Teaching and Learning. She was at North Campus as the principal for a couple of years before last year taking on a district role. Wore a lot of different hats last year during a very interesting year. And now she's stepped into the role of Assistant Superintendent for Teaching and Learning. So Dr. Gillespie, I'll turn it over to you if you want to get us started.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. I'm just refreshing to make sure I have the #1 ranked question. All right, Caroline, our first question that has come in is, when I checked last, 50% of my Black, Indigenous, and people of color families had not yet chosen a learning model for the fall. How can schools ensure families who have traditionally been marginalized by our systems? Sorry, let me reread that. How can schools ensure families who have been traditionally marginalized by our systems that their perspectives are needed and heard?
That's a great question. I think I would answer that question with a couple of more questions. I think the point that systems have traditionally excluded that's the right lens to come to this question or this puzzle with. I would ask or wonder, how are we getting their perspectives? You know, one of the chuckles I had early in the time of the pandemic was a school system that shall not be named said, we sent out an email to see which families were connected. It's like, you send out an email to see which families were connected? And then they chuckle that they're like, oh yeah, that's ridiculous. If they weren't connected, they wouldn't have gotten the email. So I wonder if 50% have not selected. The question is, for what reason, and can we go and find out more? Is there another way we can get close to find out their preferences rather than assume that there is no preference, and wonder, have we chosen the right method of finding out that information? I think that's probably one way to think about starting.
Got it. Thanks. Wayne, do you want me to keep going, or you want to ask the next question?
Go ahead, Allison. I'm refreshing the list and it's slow. So,
what would you say is the most important advice for us as educators to have in mind as we return to school this fall?
Oh, that's a great question. I think that what I would want teachers to have in mind as they're returning to school this fall, to think about themselves as democracy builders and democracy dreamers, first and foremost. You are building the American democracy right now. It's being rebuilt, and it's going to be rebuilt with the young people that are in your classroom. So it's, how can you start to see your job and your role as probably the most important role in the country right now? And it is, how do you tell the whole American story that includes everybody and recognizes everybody's role in building it, and see yourself as one is like, if I don't know all the stories, how do I get educated really quickly so that I know all the stories and I can hold all the stories in the land? I think that is probably the most critical point for school teachers right now, because I think kids are saying like, oh my gosh, what's happening to this place that I thought was my country? It is not what I thought it was. And that is traumatizing, when you realize that the place where you thought you called home now does not even look familiar. So it's, how do you then inspire kids to say, you need to learn to read because we got to rebuild the country. You got to learn math because we got to rebuild the country. And it's going to be you all and us working together. That's the reason why we go for content mastery, right? And I think like that spirit is, I mean, it gives me goosebumps when I think about like, that's where we come, that's how we come to our work right now. It's like, how do we start rebuilding Minneapolis? How do we start rebuilding Minnesota? Brick by brick, student by student, idea by idea, and knowing that educators just hold that tremendous power to do that.
All right, I'll grab the next one, Allison. Right. All right, how can we bring student voice into the forefront so we're teaching students in ways most beneficial to them? Our strategic plan calls on us to amplify student voice.
Yeah, great question. So I think that there's an opportunity in this pandemic. I'm chewing ice, so sorry. Great opportunity in this pandemic to say, okay, how do we say every 4 to 6 weeks at the end of the marking period or the 9 weeks, we're going to stop and do 3 days of empathy interviews with students. We're going to start with the students who were not successful. And we're going to say, what worked for you? What didn't work? How do we do better? And have that be a part of just the way we work. Checking in with those families, checking in with those teachers who had a great experience and those who didn't have a great experience, and starting to look at this year as we're designing it together. So as far as amplifying student voice, I mean, tactically building in checkpoints into the calendar, whereas that's the expectation to do it. And not saying like, oh, it's a nice to have. It's like, no, we have 2 to 3 days to do student empathy interviews in our calendar, and then we have another 2 days to synthesize the ideas and figure out what the insights are. I think planning time, because we know as educators, if it's on the calendar, it gets done. If it's not on the calendar, it doesn't happen. So how do we actually, I think in making that intention to build it into the calendar is probably a smart technical move to make sure that student voice has its time in our work streams.
Okay, thanks. Allison, you got?
I do. Well, we did that one. What are some of the first steps to creating a safe school environment for our students of color? As we start this school year in a very high emotional state, I want to ensure that our students of color feel the most supported they can be.
So I think that I'm going to ask, I'm going to answer this question in 2 ways. I think if you are a white American teaching students of color, how to do that, I think is one, making sure that the curriculum tells the truth and acknowledges what's happening, and why it's happening, and that it has always happened. And this is the dilemma in our country, right? And saying like, yeah, and it's not great. It's not great for any of us, right? And so I think it's one part is like telling, like one, knowing the truth, and then having the courage to tell it, and then let students wrestle with it and make sense of it for themselves. I think that is important. I mean, when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, I grew up in the state of Virginia, and they didn't tell the truth. I got the truth at home. And it was just what it was, but it's like, how can we start to use our institutions to say, yeah, this is what's happening outside. This is what redlining is. This is how it's impacting our district. Now, like, what do you think about it? I think in order to make students feel safe, it's how do you have a thoughtful, responsive, truth-telling curriculum that it also empowers them to do something about it, and that you teach every single student with the expectation that they could be the president, and you push them as if they can be the president and they have every single right to believe that they can lead this country and lead the world. And you're like, you don't give up on them until you're like, I want to ask you to read 25 books this year because that's what is needed. I believe in you so much, and you push those expectations. I think that's how you show that you care. Give thoughtful feedback. I mean, these are things that we already know how to do. Thoughtful feedback. I had one of my most powerful teachers said to me, she said, "You work hard, not in the right way. I'm gonna sit down and show you what you're doing wrong." This is a white woman. I was like, you're working hard. You're not working in the right way. And I was like, that is probably the most thoughtful feedback I've ever gotten. She said, it's not about effort. She's like, this is what you need to do. And I was like, thank you. Grades took off. Right. So I think like, how do you get really close to students to understand what they're doing and how they're coming to their work, and supporting them. And when you see them, it's like, I see more in you than you could ever imagine. And I'm going to push and develop you so that you can be, you can be the person who creates the next best version of ourselves and our country.
I think this is related. So I think you've perhaps touched on it, but I'll be teaching 6th grade social studies this year. What should I be keeping in mind as we start to talk about issues of racial inequity in society?
Oh gosh. I think in our country, what we don't quite talk about a lot is how it's so connected to our economy. And it has always been connected to and that's a touchy subject. But I think if going back to 1619 and what was the economic reason to bring enslaved Africans to America, because there were reasons that was the decision point, and then how did it just become convenient to keep a group of people in a subservient economic and political class? I think having kids wrestle with that, it's like, okay, I understand that. Now, the cost of that is awful. Did people understand the moral cost of that? The question is, yes, but why did they do it still? Well, because it was convenient. And who wants to give up their luxurious lifestyles? Oh, that's why this is so complicated. I think for kids to understand the complexity, but then say it's our job to say, how do we live without hurting each other? That's the design challenge. How do we live a great life without killing other people? That's the challenge. Is it possible? Of course. We put a man on the moon. Of course it's possible. But it's how do we give ourselves time to think about what could be? Right? And I think that conversation of where our country was in the 1600s and the 1500s, and not glossing over that, and knowing that it's quite interesting that the same people, the Europeans that came here, were escaping oppression only to become oppressors of other people. We often don't talk about that. It's oh, so that's interesting. They were escaping oppression from where they came from. So it's that trauma came here. So if that trauma was never healed, if you just escaped it, then that trauma that happened to you, you will do to other people until you stop the cycle. So I think if kids know that, it's one saying that when where have I experienced hurt? I don't want to hurt other people. So how do I heal myself? But then how does this then play into the whole story of, if people are never healed, then they perpetuate the pain, the cycle of trauma. And what we're seeing right now is the cycle of trauma playing out real time every single moment. And it's overwhelming. And I think kids having kids, give them space to make sense of that, and apply it to their lives on with their friends and with their family. And then I think give them skills to heal. How do you heal? How do you heal hurt? How do you acknowledge pain? How do you apologize? Doesn't mean you're weak. It just says and you try to do better. I think looking at the macro level and then saying so let's talk about how you handle your friends and how you handle your family and the kid who doesn't have any friends, all of those pieces, bring it macro, then all the way down to micro. I think that could help 6th graders make more sense of what they're seeing and why they're seeing it. I hope this makes sense.
It does, absolutely. I think this next question is related to what you just ended with. How do you address parents who think school is for academics and feel like addressing racism is a theft of time in college preparation? The prevalent racism in our district is propagated in the home actively and passively.
Yeah, good question. So I think parents need education. I think any school that is going to take on equity work, they have to think about how do they educate parents too. I think acknowledging that our country is where it is because not everyone has the same story is a real acknowledgement. I trust that most people, I think if most people knew the same story, they'll be okay, I was mistaught. The academics I got weren't the right academics. So I think that's one acknowledgement, like what kind of support needs to be in place for parents. I also think that it's like we have to understand that we don't need any more literate racists. I mean, like, and being literate in our country at this moment also includes being an anti-racist. And that is a competency that can be taught and practiced, just like being able to pull out a main idea out of a text. In fact, it's probably the skill set that most Americans need right now if we want to get to where we could be. I think having conversations with parents to say, one of the things that I said, like, I've seen, and I think I said this in the keynote, like, I'm the third Caroline in my family. We're all seeing same versions of the same American story. When does it stop? It only stops if we say, we're tired of seeing this. I don't want my children or my nieces and nephews to have to see this again, right? You all, like, the kids shouldn't have to deal with this as adults. So it has to be an academic competency, probably one of the most challenging ones, because it requires an integration of, like, legal discourse, historical discourse, scientific discourse, all at the same time, right? All at the same time, like, understand, like, why is this playing out? Oh, and economic discourse. Why is this all playing out in the same way? Incredibly academic, rigorous stuff. So, and I think, like, having families see that, one, it's I think there's a political candidate that said it's the soul of our soul is at stake right now. It's like, dude, like, how can we sit aside? Like, what's the role of our education if it tolerates suffering of other people? Like, isn't our education supposed to be that which alleviates suffering? That we can build and design things that help people suffer less. Like, I think we need to have a different value proposition for why we even go to school.
All right, Caroline, in a moment here. How do teachers start to relinquish and share power in the classroom?
I think you just do it. And that the first time you do it is going to be messy, and you acknowledge that, this is the first time I'm doing it. It's going to be uncomfortable, but I'm just going to do it. And I think, like, small things like getting feedback from kids and listening is one way to share power. I think, letting kids in on the way, all the stories is a way to share power. Like, this is really how the system works. I'm going to explain this to you. Like, sharing power doesn't mean, like, you throw everything to a kid who doesn't necessarily have all the capacities to handle it. It's like, I'm going to actually show you the playbook. I'm going to show you how this works and why it's so important for you to do your best. That's also a part of sharing power. But I think in the teacher in the classroom, like, feedback, asking kids, like, did that work? What do you need from me? Did you like the way we did that assignment? Did it strike you in a way? Did it make you want to work harder? If not, what could I have done differently to make you want to work harder? I think just starting with simple questions for feedback, and then, like, listening and knowing that it's going to be uncomfortable, but those opportunities for discomfort are also the most powerful spaces for us to grow as professionals. Like, everyone wants to be told that everything is great all the time, but we never grow that way. But it's how do we say, like, oh, that didn't feel good. All right, I got over that. Now I'm going to implement what I heard. But it also, I think for us as humans, like, no, that didn't feel good at all. Doesn't mean I'm a bad person, but it just didn't feel good. I'm going to work on that. Like, so I think seeding power is like, how do I put my ego aside to invite others to be on the journey with me?
How do we didn't ask this question. How do we, as mostly white educators, we didn't ask this question, right? Bring authentic change to our classrooms and acknowledge the stories and experiences of our marginalized kids?
So I think that, so I'm not a white educator, so I'm going to state that. But from the seat that I sit in, I think that one thing that I have learned by working closely with white educators that have committed to anti-racism as a part of their pedagogical stance, there's a moment in their journey where they realize they've been mistaught, even though they went to the most elite schools. That's a crisis moment, because then they also say, there's a reason why I don't know these stories. And then it's just like, why, what reason is it that I don't, why am I just learning all of this now? And after that anger subsides, I think they're like, all right, let's get down to business. So I think for white educators is to be very critical of the way you were raised. Very critical of why is it that you're just learning to how to be fluent in race conversations at 30 and 40? Why is it that most white educators don't know about the Readjuster Party at the end of Reconstruction, where blacks and whites worked together to gain political power in the South after the Civil War? Like, what? And and took back power from the planter elite class. What? Like, most Americans don't know that. Most white Americans don't know that. Like, it's like, how do we then say, like, wait a minute, why is it that my American history goes from 1609, when 3 boats came to this country, to 1776, and then it jumps to the Vietnam War, right? Oh, World War II. Like, we don't talk about what happened between the Civil War and World War I. That's when our country was built, right? All, like, most of the institutions built at that time, like the importance of the franchise and the vote and representation, all of that, and all those machinations about denying the vote, getting the vote, the fight for the vote, happened between Reconstruction and World War I. But those are the periods that we don't know very much. It's like we gloss over it in the history books, right? Because it's complicated and it's ugly, right? But it's thinking like we don't know half the story has not been told. And how do we, as educated, literate Americans, say, like, you know what, I'm not going to assume that I know everything. I'm going to continue to be a learner of my own story. And then I think when it gets really difficult, go and talk to your parents. Ask your parents about their stories and their parents' stories, because y'all, we are really close to this ugliness. We are really close to it. And because we don't know it doesn't mean it doesn't live in our bodies. So I think the more courage we have to say, you know, if our parents are still living, pick up the phone and say, can I talk to you about something? Tell me when you realized. What did you do? And not to judge them, because everyone's doing literally the best that they can, but just to understand how this plays out. And then I think as white educators to say, like, you know what, it's going to stop with me. Like, I'm going to make sure that any child that comes through my door is going to know the story and going to know that I am here to support them. And I might mess up along the way. I might say the wrong things because I'm learning too. And it's my commitment to support every single child that walks through my door.
Okay. I had it here. Give me a moment. Here, so this is actually it's the next one, and it's actually perfect given what you just said. How can educators interrupt systems when we are told that all students, including those being overtly racist, must feel comfortable in our classes? So
I think I would challenge that question, that you're going to feel comfortable and you should be comfortable. You shouldn't be. You shouldn't be uncomfortable all the time, because you can't grow if you're uncomfortable all the time. But I do think creating spaces of discomfort is important for growth. I think helping kids understand that discomfort and the way it experiences and the way it's experienced in the body is a signal to learn something, not a bad thing. I think our culture often tells us when we feel something, it's bad. It's that, no, actually, when you feel something, it's a signal. What is it? You're not going to die, but if your stomach is hurting, why? If you're getting sweaty palms, why? Let's talk about connecting our bodies to our minds. So I think first challenging this notion of comfort and how it should be prioritized. I think second, I think there are different types of support that students who have been in who have identities that have given them certain types of power, and students whose identities have created experiences of powerlessness for them. I think that is I think those situations have to be handled very, very carefully. I think we have to acknowledge, I think for kids to acknowledge that sometimes their privilege blinds them, they don't see and can't see everything. That's fair. Like, even though I'm in a Black woman queer body, there's some things I don't see because of my middle class upbringing. Some things I don't see because I'm the second generation in my family to go to college. Like, there's some things that come out of my mouth that are real classist sometimes. I'm working on that, but that's by virtue of my story. But the only reason why I know that is because I'm with people who are different than me, and they say, you know what? That's not right what you just said. If I already surrounded myself with people like me, they would cheer me on and make me feel great about everything I say, right? No opportunity for growth there. So I think the opportunity, I think for white students and white educators, is how do you stay in relationship with people who are different from you so that you can learn more about yourself and in the world. And that is most difficult because our culture tells us to get away from suffering as fast as you can, right? Move away from the places that are dark and painful and bloody and get as far away. But it's actually at those moments that you realize, one, the collective humanity of all of us, and two, the own personal journey that we're on. So I would say, like, if I had ever had to have the chance to run a school system, I was like, you know what? How can we say relationships across lines of difference? That's a competency. You need to be able to do that. You need to be able to have relationships with people who are different from you, because that's a skill. That's a skill, right? You don't have to like everybody, but like, how do you create how do you say, like, you know what? We're going to practice having civil interactions with people who are different. And I'm going to teach you how to do it, because most of us who are really good at it had a lot of practice, right? So I think teaching kids like that is just as important as being able to solve a quadratic equation, especially at this moment in our country.
All right, well, we're butting up against our end. I think that's maybe a great spot to wrap up the Q&A. So thank you all for joining us in this virtual convocation experience today. And thank you, Caroline, for
you're very welcome.
Your expertise and providing us with advice to best serve our students as we begin our school year. We didn't make it through all of our questions, but the submissions give us a strong basis with which to start the school year. We have gathered a lot of what's on our staff members' minds, so that's an invaluable tool for us. It was a nice opportunity to be able to introduce you all to Caroline and our Voices framework, and there will be continued opportunities to work with both throughout the year. We appreciate you all logging in to join us today. A public version of this convocation experience event will soon be made available on YouTube today as well. And with that, go Bears. So thank you.
Go Bears. Have a great year.
Bye. Take care, Caroline. Bye, everyone. Take care.